Let's start with the basics. The long-standing practice in the United States since the Watergate reforms is to have a 10-year term for the FBI director to make it nonpartisan. Donald Trump has now broken, in 2 terms, he's broken that precedent twice, famously firing James Comey to put in Chris Wray, who was his pick. And President Biden left Chris Wray on the job so as to try to avoid a cycle of partisanship. And then Donald Trump came in and with the expectation and the announcement that he would oust Wray, Wray stepped back, resigned, and that brings us to the news today. So even before you get to this hearing of one of the most controversial cabinet picks Trump has made, you have to remember we are already in a cycle of partisanship that has been one way. Kash Patel faces his FBI confirmation hearing today. The New York Times summarized some of the back and forth like this. Patel alternated between deference and defiance, repeatedly distancing himself from his own previous statements because apparently they are too much even for a Senate that is under Republican control. He can get through on a party line vote, but he had to walk back certain statements. And this is what Democrats partly zeroed in on, what they see as not opinions or observations or speculation about Mr. Patel, but rather using this process and their powers, even in the minority, to put him under oath and to scrutinize him for what he himself has said about January 6th, which is a convicted sedition against the United States, even though it has since been pardoned by Donald Trump, about who won the 2020 race, which relates to some of the criminal activities that day, as well as the idea that Patel would go after what he calls miscreants or government gangsters or enemies. The verbiage has been debated, and we'll get to that. But whether he would use or misuse law enforcement power to go after basically Donald Trump's political opponents.
Mr. Patel has neither the experience, the temperament, nor the judgment to lead.
Did Donald Trump lose the 2020 presidential election?
President Biden's election was certified. He was the president. I don't know how else to say it.
Well, the other way to say it is he won.
I find it troubling that you do not know the law here. And let me tell you what the law is.
Tell them you're proud of what you did, Mr. Patel.
This is not about bingo cards or games. This is not about revenge.
That was your first test. You failed it.
You can see at times the Democratic senators used what they have there, this colloquy with him, to make their points because they found their view. They found him to be at times simply evasive, and so they would hammer the points we quoted there. Now, Republicans who have clamored for a lot of changes inside law enforcement, some say it's like, quote unquote, working the ref, appeared to now view Patel as someone that they've been looking for.
You will not lie, and that's why I wholeheartedly support you.
Making up evidence, lying to get Donald Trump. Do you promise all of us those days are over at the FBI?
Yes, Senator.
There is absolutely no doubt that you have the experience and the expertise to lead the FBI.
You've made a lot of people mad, haven't you?
If you're not ticking off some people, you're not doing your job right.
Why are the Democrats so afraid of you?
You're going to get confirmed, and you're going to lead this agency back to what it always should have been.
Now, that was some of the tenor on the Republican side. And just to state this in plain English, clear as possible, as we try to do around here, there are plenty of valid debates about federal law enforcement. And so in eras past, we've had debates at the Attorney General and FBI confirmations about those policies. How preventive should the FBI be? How much counterterror intelligence should it use? Should it be trying to prevent and stop certain types of threats or crimes? Or should it, more like local police, only round people up and react? And there have been big, robust debates about that, and that's all fair game. But today, one of the largest issues was not even about those kind of policy debates. It's about what we might call ethics or honesty or the Constitution. Because you have to remember, the FBI, before the reforms that have held for the last 50 years, was a place that was abused. If you go to a normal law school or a normal school that doesn't have a partisan agenda, you will learn about how the FBI was used against dissidents, against civil rights leaders. Martin Luther King holiday came recently. It's a holiday because the United States, on a bipartisan basis, has recognized Martin Luther King as a civil rights leader worthy of respect. And yet he and other civil rights leaders faced what looked like abuse of power historically by the FBI. So Whether we go back to that or not is a question more of ethics than policy. Do you want people who are allegedly, potentially unethical, pursuing what I mentioned, enemies lists and abuse of power, to go after people because they criticize the government or are civil rights dissidents or are political opponents of the administration? And that brings us to something that I want to be as fair as possible. It has sparked a conversation about a, quote, enemies list. Even Trump officials have talked about how they may or may not want an enemies list. But let's quote exactly. It's a list of 60 names. It's in Patel's book, and we'll show you. It's been referred to as an enemies list. It reads like a list of enemies. It is, in his words, and I'm going to leave this up on the screen because we want to be fair about the evidence. You see the headline there. It's an appendix of members of the executive branch deep state. That's a term that Donald Trump has used with derision and sometimes to suggest that people are disloyal. And you can see the quote at the upper left, it is what he calls, Mr. Patel, quote, government gangsters. Now, you can decide what the word gangster means. For most people, it's something bad and sometimes criminal. And if there's a gangster around, you might want them arrested or charged. This is what many people have referred to as the so-called, quote, enemies list. And that brings us to the other person dealing with law enforcement, according to Donald Trump, the Attorney General pick, Pam Bondi. The DOJ and the FBI are supposed to work hand in hand. It's complicated because we've seen tension between the agencies for sure. But I want to remind you today what Pam Bondi, who is Trump's pick, said at her own confirmation hearing under oath. She was questioned about what I just reminded you, this government gangsters list or enemies list from Patel. And this is what she said.
There will never be an enemies list within the Department of Justice.
When Trump wins in 2024 and is in power in 2025, we can prosecute them.
You're reading a partial statement, so I'm unable to fully respond.
It's been referred to as an enemies list. You've called them deep state.
It's not an enemies list. That is a total mischaracterization.
Do you plan to investigate James Comey, who's on your list?
I have no intentions of going backwards.
How about
and
Bill
every
Barr?
intention of using the Constitution.
If President Trump were to order you to open an investigation into any of these individuals, let's say Vice President Harris, would you?
The president has said publicly that he will allow the FBI to remain independent, and I have said as much as well.
Those are not direct answers. He's under oath, and he can conduct himself how he chooses, and then the Senate responds. Those aren't clear answers. And we began with Pam Bondi, who has been criticized for many reasons, because it shows you very recently how a Trump appointee could directly answer it. She just said, no enemies list. She didn't say, what do you mean by enemies, or gangster is different than enemy, or deep state is different than that. And in all fairness, I showed you the materials so you could make your own mind up. But what we got from Patel today under oath was at times some distancing, suggesting that he knew he needed to do something more to try to keep his nomination alive. That's typically how these hearings work. And yet, on this core question of whether he, someone who's talked about taking apart the FBI as we know it, gutting or emptying out the Hoover building, going after, quote, government gangsters and deep state people, will he do that looking backwards? He couldn't give you the direct no that Pam Bondi said, no enemies list. And Patel is being asked these questions not randomly, not because of people are paranoid, but because he is at best, diplomatically, a somewhat unusual pick for this type of job, with less of the type of federal law enforcement managerial experience that other people have had, who also has explicitly discussed the idea, plan, or threat of going after people, not for what they do, not because they were found guilty of crimes or evidence, but because of who they are, that they disagree with him or MAGA or Trump, that they do journalism or other things in science or facts that they view as somehow a problem. And under oath, he failed to distance himself from those key past claims.
The Clappers and the Brennans and the Comeys of the world will always lie. We will prosecute them for lying to Congress.
Do you plan to investigate James Comey, who's on your list?
I have no intentions of going backwards.
There may be a full-fledged investigation into those in Congress who aided and abetted this corrupt criminal activity.
You say you're going to ferret out the deep state?
No one
Yes or
that
no?
did not break the law will be investigated.
So which is it? Is it listing names and vowing to investigate them, which is what you just heard, and it goes on like that? Or is it the semi-distancing but ultimately pretty vague statements he made today? And remember, when pressed on the enemies list, which Pam Bondi was able to say, no enemies list, he said, well, we're not going to look backwards. You don't need to be a lawyer to know that all criminal investigations look backwards, because this ain't Tom Cruise's Minority Report. You don't prosecute crimes that may occur in the future. So his non-denial, semi-distancing statement was not exactly even passing what you might call the Pam Bondi test.